I know that I'm walking into a lifetime commitment to do better and to serve my community. And that is something I can't erase and I cannot run from.
Being a student here is something bigger than just studying and getting good grades.
Much bigger.
He's following in the footsteps of a long history of Morehouse men, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
May mean going to jail, but I'm going if it means that.
He was born a common man, but had an extraordinary dream.
To end the long night of racial injustice.
Equal rights for all, regardless of race. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929.
What kind of world was Dr. King born into?
It's kind of hard to envision a world that was completely segregated by race in this country. You did not have the freedom as a person of color to go to a restaurant, to go to a movie unless you were seated in separate seating. A world where you couldn't go to the college of your choice. A world that was essentially segregated from the cradle to the grave.
He attended Morehouse College at only 15 years old, eventually becoming a Baptist minister like his father. During the 1950s and 60s, King led hundreds of thousands of young people in protests, demanding equal rights for African Americans. They were met with clubs and blasted with hoses. But under Dr. King's leadership, the protesters chose a strategy of peace and nonviolence.
As a practitioner of nonviolence, he wrote a lot and spoke a lot about the nature of violence in the world.
Well, I think this is a very historic moment.
Dr. King first became the face of the civil rights movement in 1956, leading the Montgomery bus boycott when African Americans stopped taking the bus to protest segregation. It eventually led to the Supreme Court ruling that found Alabama's segregation laws unconstitutional. King gave the movement momentum with his inspiring speech to hundreds of thousands at the March on Washington in 1963, calling for change in his I Have a Dream speech.
I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his civil rights work in 1964, but his fight for equal rights was far from over, and he was put in prison nearly 30 times.
He's dealing with a people that will not stop until they have full freedom and human dignity.
In 1965, Dr. King and other civil rights protesters were attacked during the marches in Selma, Alabama. Police officers surrounded the protesters, throwing tear gas and beating them with clubs. It became known as Bloody Sunday. The images of that day shocked the country. Selma became a turning point, motivating more Americans to join the fight for civil rights. Because of King's determination and his followers' commitment, the U.S. government passed new laws to protect the rights of all Americans, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
I'm not going to integrate.
But many in the country didn't want change, and that made King a target. He received death threats, and his house was firebombed. In his final speech, he spoke about standing firm in the face of hate.
I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you.
As Dr. King said in his final speech the night before he was assassinated, it's a question of injustice. Whether it's an injustice that has racial origins, gender origins, or sexual identity origins, it's a question of injustice.
It was the next day, April 4th, 1968, when at the age of 39, Dr. King was shot to death by James Earl Ray.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
It was a crushing blow to millions of people across the country.
I am the resurrection and the life.
But nothing could stop the power of King's ideas.
There's a lot of changes that have happened in society.
Because of Martin Luther.
Because of him, and then I think what happened to him. I think the assassination proved that a movement doesn't necessarily die, but I think movements can take different forms.
His legacy still lives on today. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the face of America and led a movement bigger than just a man.
There have been some gains, and yet there's a lot that lies ahead. We're seeing that now with current contemporary movements like hashtag Say Her Name, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, these contemporary social justice movements. There's a lot of work to be done.
Do you think we have reached the dream that MLK was talking about?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Tom Hansen, Channel 1 News.